questions, and Astri and I'll have a fireside chat. I'd like to start with Astri's book, Ability Innovation. And Astri, I mean, I absolutely love the book, and I particularly loved your introduction. And I just wanted to read a couple of sentences. Rob is my older brother. He's a swimmer, a bowler, a horseback rider, and a music appreciator. He is also nonverbal and has autism and Down syndrome, but he is not defined by his intellectual and his developmental disabilities. It's such a beautiful introduction. And I guess I was wondering, what was it like growing up with Rob?
Yes, and Dana, I'm just so happy you're asking about that. I could talk about my brother all day, every day. He's a little over a year older than him, so as you can imagine, I worshipped him throughout my life. He's my best friend in the entire world. Growing up with Rob, it's interesting because obviously we all only can speak from our experience. So that was just what my life was. That's just how it, like, I remember as a kid, I never really considered the differences between how my experience having a brother with an intellectual disability, particularly who's nonverbal, kind of differed from my classmates. But looking back, I think definitely I'm like very, very close with Rob, and he always showed me from a young age that people were different, and we were all unique in different ways. And even though, like, and I think, as we've talked about so many times before, he's first and foremost an individual, and he's a unique individual with all of these different interests, who's amazing and wonderful, and who is one of my like people in the world. And obviously autism and Down syndrome profoundly affect his life as they affect mine. They've introduced me to the IDD community. They've introduced me to so many amazing people in that community who I wouldn't have known otherwise, but they're not who he is.
Right. Well, what led you to write the book?
Yeah, so like I said, I worship my brother. He's my best friend in the entire world. And I didn't know for a long time. I don't think I ever thought about what would happen after he graduated from high school. I think even like that was when college still seemed vague to me, and a job still seemed kind of out in the distant future, and we didn't really have to worry about it. And it wasn't until my brother turned about 16 and my parents started discussing housing and what that would look like for him that I really became aware of kind of what was going on. And in particular, as I talk about in the book, we visited one home once just to see kind of what it was like, and it was an intentional community. And I remember looking at it, and it's an amazing place, incredible. But I was like, this isn't right for Rob. And I compared it to like a college visiting, because at the time I'd been doing a lot of college visits. And I was like, well, I don't have the feeling, so I don't think he's gonna end up here. There's gonna be better places. And I remember at the end of it, my dad saying, this was one of the best places I've ever seen. This is one of the best places in the country. And it was very upsetting to me, not because it wasn't a wonderful place, but because it wasn't right for him. And why should there be three best that aren't going to fit everyone's descriptions? And I think I'm very privileged in that I have parents who are taking on this response. As so many parents, I always say, any parent could write an encyclopedia on housing, I think, or any guardian who's been through this process. It's so long and time consuming, and so much goes into it. It's a lifetime commitment. And but for me, because I'm a sibling and I wasn't at the forefront of that, I was like, well, I want to see the best things going on. And I think also just because he's my brother and I want the best for him, I was like, I need to know that there's amazing options out there, and I need to find them and bring them to Baltimore however I can, so that I can be active in his housing process. So I really considered it a privilege that I got to kind of take on the more positive aspect and try to see the best. And that's and I just started talking to people and reaching out and connecting. And which is how I came to Ability Innovation. It was the people I spoke to, like you, Dana, who really wrote the book.
Well, you identified, 4, core areas that make that help define, whether, and I'll use the term you used, a group home is really high quality. And the first one was design of the house. The second one was the staff. The third, the culture. And the fourth, the procedures and programs of the organization. Wondered if you could kind of maybe take a bit of a deep dive into those 4 areas and kind of share what you learned. I think that would be very, very helpful to all of us.
Of course. And I have to say before starting, like, I think obviously any categories, there's overlap and there's contradiction, and I kind of organize those based on themes I saw, but there's so much more that goes into it. I think funding particularly, I don't go into as much because it differs state to state. But obviously, like I said, these are just 4 categories I decided to focus on. I started kind of talking about like the pathways to a home and finding a home and different options there. I think that was also kind of the process I was in at that moment, was looking for options, and it's very difficult. I think anyone here who's a parent knows it is like finding the right option is very difficult. I talk about one time in the book, my mom and I going and touring provider, and at the end of the tour they were like, well, you can get on the wait list, but you don't really think he's gonna be at one of our homes. Like, we have a huge wait list. You're not even in this county. And we were like, well, why are we here? Why? And it just, there was a lot of right. I mean, you couldn't have told it, but it was a lot, just constantly looking. And it's interesting kind of thinking about this category after, like, now that my brother, he is 3 weeks in a supportive living environment in Maryland. And I was like, well, what does this category mean now? And I think it's just that constant reevaluation, because the home you live in when you're 20, probably, I mean, it could be, but it also might not be the home you want to live in when you're 40. And so, exactly. Right, like, it makes, I feel like so much of this, as you talked about last week with Brian, is just, it's human. Like, I don't plan on living in the same place for 20 years, but maybe that works for some people. And so in this Pathways to a Home, I found the different organizations that were doing. So there's kind of, you can find existing service providers like LSA, finding a home which has an opening. There's also creating your own supportive living environment. An organization which is really cool, which helps people create their own living environment, is Partners for Housing, which was started in Washington and is currently expanding to New York and looking to other states. And their structure is, okay, maybe you're not going to go through a provider. Maybe you're going to work with another family to pool your services and make a housing. How can we work to do that? And so that's maybe another option that's going to work for different people. Then another thing, maybe you don't want to go in a singular group home. Maybe you want to go in a community, like a different community living settings. And in that case, there's going to be, you can look at homes which are already created, like Camp Hill, which is a location in New York, Pathfinder Village, which is also in New York. There's different ways to kind of go about it. And that's a process that constantly needs to be reevaluated. So that's kind of the first. And then design. So design takes on so many different forms. which I talk about. From there's design empathy, which I mentioned in my book, which is just what color do I want the walls to be? What maybe someone with sensory sensitivity is going to have different colors they want compared to someone who doesn't have those sensitivities. And that kind of relates back to the housing. When I'm choosing a roommate, let's make sure we're on the same page with that. Let's make sure the families are on the same page with that. And design can also kind of be more in, like some houses are using, you know, voice controls to do the lights. And as we know, I feel like we live in houses with like homes are becoming smarter. So how can we utilize that technology? And I think it's funny, since my brother just moved into this house 3 weeks ago, one thing I was thinking was, when I was like, I want to make something for his room. And I made him a like collage of photos, just like of tons of fun photos that I have with him or him with his friends. And because that's what my friends in college did. Like we all had like tons of photos. And because I was like, that's fun, that makes it home. You know, you want things in your house. You don't want to be in a hotel lobby when you're sitting in your living room.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And like it, like I said, it's only human. And then staff relationships, which is something obviously that I mentioned LSA in for your practices, is just that idea of and the most important thing, as I said in my book, is cultivating a positive relationship with the staff, which LSA has done so well. And it's such a privilege to be here to talk with you all about it, because and I think you can, I mean, as a parent too, you know more than anything, the people you spend your day with, these are the people who you're entrusting one of the people you love most in the entire world with. And it's scary, and it's terrible. And I think almost all of us probably have horror stories about someone who was either unreliable or maybe didn't feel like they were treated. Like that's my biggest fear, is my brother getting used by someone, or being made uncomfortable, or being uncomfortable with someone. I mean, the connections in our life are what make it rich. And I think that, right, like it's human. And I think that kind of relates to that final category of community, and how are we building community? And I think that's also another thing that LSA does so well. Even when you were talking with Brian last week about how your organizations have worked together to create lives for people, to create really enriching experiences, because it's that same thing of, and I think I'm also going to refer to Brian. He talked about how there's a diminishing social circle as you get older. Like maybe it's less friends, and you like becoming more isolated, because if you don't have friends at school, I know like my brother is nonverbal, so his relationships with people are very different and have to be kind of facilitated by my family, who drives in places, his direct care providers. And so if he goes to a home and he doesn't have people he can connect with, even if he's going to a day program every day, what's he doing, you know, the afternoon, the evenings? It can be very isolating. And I think this is a place where there's also so much opportunity, and where intentional communities have become an interesting option. Like one option is Three Oaks in Saline, Michigan, and they're a development company which builds communities, and they're trying to expand it to other places. But the communities is people are buying homes knowing they're going to live next to group homes, which is an very like cool thing to do. Because I mean, like, I think I'd love to live into a community with group homes and make those connections with people, whereas other people might have fears or concerns about living. I think, Dana, we talked about this earlier.
Yeah.
A lot of people have unfounded fears living in communities with group homes, which is such a missed opportunity. But then this can also take more organic forms. Like, and I think you can, we've spoken about this, and that's reaching out to the community members, reaching out to the neighbors, making sure they're not afraid of what they don't know.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that certainly is, it's a two-way street, isn't it? You know, the whole notion of being a good neighbor, you know, is getting out there and connecting and engaging. And um, fears dissolve, when when you become connected and those. Um, is there anything that just really jumped out at you that if you were looking for a group home, how would you know that it was a good one?
And that's a good question, because also I think visiting places, I've seen a lot of great group homes again, which I was told my brother would be on waiting lists for 10 years. I think, you see it, and I think staff, again, are just where it shines through. How are people being treated? How are people treating one another? And that's something I think in Illinois, which I discussed in my book a few years back, there was of people being abused in group homes, and it was a systemic issue that wasn't being addressed. And one of the biggest things was people, like staff, abusing residents, and then because of that, residents having abusive relationships with each other. And that was kind of the part that was publicized. Look at these people who aren't behaving as they should, who can't live in a community because they have outlashes. And that's not to say if someone has different behavioral needs that they're being abused, obviously. But it's to say that we need to see how people are treating one another in order to better understand the culture of the place that they're at. And you said that I have to use you for this. You said so well, it's constantly articulating that culture. Is that how is that being articulated? And I do think even looking at a home, thinking, can I see and this is a privilege not everyone has, because not everyone can take the time. It's so time consuming. And a lot of times if parents are older and they don't, and their child or relative needs to go in a home in an urgent matter, maybe you can't do this right away. But it's looking at a home and saying, how can I find a home here? And then if it's an urgent situation, how can I make myself a home here? What can I do? What organizations? How can we connect with neighbors? How can we add pictures to the walls to make it feel like a place we can connect with? I think what surprised me most writing this was a world that I was going to be entering, the housing world, through my brother, that I knew nothing about before, and that most people know absolutely nothing about. I mean, I'll tell my friends kind of about some of the stuff I'm interested in, and people just, if you're not working in this community, if you don't have someone connected to this community, you're often not aware. And I think that's what I was so shocked and upset with my own lack of knowledge, that I think one of the takeaways is this needs to be something we're talking about, because the more we're talking about it, the easier it's going to be for a parent when they have a kid who's going to require supportive living, for them to have a wider support group of their own friends who aren't as connected to the community to help them and to make the best housing option possible.
Yeah, I was just thinking as you were speaking that, for me, it's always been about a culture of treating each other with respect. It's okay to have differences, but we treat each other with respect. And if you can get there, it sure goes a long way. And I think it's a lot easier to, it's for each of us, to be on the receiving end, and it's a lot easier to tell whether we're being treated with respect, and it feels good. But your point is that you bring such a fresh point of view to the whole topic. You started to talk a little bit about takeaways and advice. Um, what would, if I was a parent and I had a, 16-year-old, you know, what are the takeaways for me? What advice would you give me in, embarking on that process? Because you've gone beyond, you've talked a little bit about intentional communities, you've talked about group homes. I don't like the term group home, but homes where multiple people, live together, or even supported living, which sounds like Rob's in supported living. My son Brent's in supported living. These are some of the main, options. Love to hear you talk a little bit about takeaways and advice.
Yes, of course. And I agree with you. The term I don't love the term group home either. That was the most standardized word I could find, which was why I used it. But I agree, supportive living is kind of what I like to go with. And I do think talking about terminology is so important and another long conversation. I think first off, I mean, parents are incredible and amazing, and everything you do is so important and so valued, even if it always doesn't feel. I just wish there was more recognition, because I think a lot of times, and I think of it like everything my parent does for me that I kind of brush off. You don't say thank you. If my parents, hi, thank you for everything. And it's because it's so difficult, and there's so much. And I think when your expectations for what your kid is going to do with their life change, it's so incredible. Like, that's a process. I always grew up with my brother having a disability. I don't know what it's like to find out that your child has a disability and how those expectations change. And I can't possibly imagine what that is like. And so, that being said, I think the advice I would give, and I think there are messages saying the same thing, is looking at all the options, looking at the different things that you can do. And it's talking to people, even if they're at organizations that have years long waiting lists. It's seeing, and it's talking to other parents and trying to find support with other parents. It's talking to, if you need a contact, talking to me, having a sounding board to talk about, especially your fears with it. What are you hoping your child will get out of it? What are they hoping? If they're verbal, whatever way they have to communicate, what are their hopes for their life, and how we can make that possible. And I do think looking at the different types of housing is a very valuable thing to do, to better understand how you can make your housing solution. And there's so many people I can think of. One who comes to mind who is Mark Olson and Point Rider, and their organization helps design intentional communities. And what they're doing is they hope to go across the country, and they've already helped some people in Texas and in Cincinnati with building an intentional community, which also has workspaces, and consulting people on that process. So maybe you don't plan on doing that. That's a huge undertaking, which most of us just simply don't have the time to do, or the resources at the moment. But maybe talk to them. What are they thinking? What do they see as key aspects of the communities they try to build, and how can we incorporate that into whatever housing solution gets created for your child or relative or loved one? And I think that's the biggest, or even like Pam Bland, like, set up a call with her, even if she's in a different state. What are the resources she recommends people using? I know one she always talks about is, I think it's Fannie Mae loans, and they're loans that you can get for housing for people with disabilities that are, or mortgages that you can get that are going to be cheaper than regular mortgages because they're subsidized. There's a lot of services we don't even know are out there, and that's also, everyone's entitled to a service coordinator. And that's so important. If you don't know that, look into it, get a service coordinator who can help you figure that out. I think but that being said, also my family has had to go beyond our service coordinator to learn about different options and different sources of funding, which could be best. And so I think, yeah, sorry, that's a long-winded way of saying connect with everyone you can and talk to everyone you can and have those conversations and build that community, because this is a topic that a lot of the pain and suffering that went on for the last century in housing was because people weren't willing to have conversations. So we need to have those conversations.
Well, fantastic. That reminds me, the history component of your book. I was appalled. Maybe you could just share a little bit of that, and maybe we all should learn from history, right? Lessons learned, but what about that history?
I know, and there's so many things that are so incredibly horrifying. I think the history for me was something I also researched from a personal standpoint. We had a relative once, my brother walked into a family party and everyone got really quiet. And that usually happens with my brother. He makes an entrance, and we were kind of like, it was a little rude. I think my parents were a little shocked that people weren't being more welcoming. But at the end, a cousin or a distant cousin came up to my parents and said, I had a son with Down syndrome, and we sent him to an institution. It was in the 60s, and he died there pretty shortly after his birth, maybe after, I think, had a couple years. And I always regretted it. And knowing that I have a relative who, like, I could have known, I could have had a connection to, whose life was needlessly ended because of disease that was spreading at an institution, that always really struck a chord with me, and always why I feel like learning about the history is so incredibly important. If you ever want to read a book directly on the history, Dr. Nielsen has The Disability History of the United States. I think it's an incredibly great resource for getting an overview. And what I think so fascinating, and I think also important there's so much with history. An important point is institutions were created as schools. Institutions were created because people thought we should educate people with disabilities and with intellectual disabilities, obviously using different terminology, which is now outdated. But that was the goal of the schools. And it wasn't these schools, like, I know my brother wouldn't have been accepted to a school like these schools originally, even because he can't speak and requires supportive living, and probably they would have considered him an idiot, was the term for the people who had required the most support, and they weren't accepted into the schools, which is also upsetting. So there was it was send someone to a prison, basically, was the only option. But anyway, so there's these schools that were created and to educate people and then send them back to the community. And then what you start seeing is people start to be educated, but then no, their community doesn't want them back. Their parents can't take them back. They don't have a place to live. And besides, they could use the help on the institution. And then eugenics comes around, at the turn of the century. And there's the science. What if these people don't reproduce? What if they don't have the right to that? What if then we can end disability? It's a ridiculous claim, but it's incredibly terrifying too that was going on. But it became, let's put them away. These are problems for society. There was actually a list published in Maryland of the problems for society, and it was homelessness, prostitution, and disabilities, all fun group put together. And they had these ridiculous studies, but it was, okay, let's send them away. Let's put them in these institutions. And I think it was Dr. Howe was his name, was one of the founders of institutions as schools. And he warned against this. he was like, this, I feel like people are getting sent here. They can't be getting sent here at these rates. These places can't keep up. And that's what happened. Like they got more and more filled. It got to the point where at some places they had troughs. At the institution in Maryland, one, they had just, troughs for eating, like pigs. And they kept people in basements just locked there with no stimulation and nothing going. It's so crazy. And this was going on, the peak was in the 60s. And even though there was advocates who were against it, Robert Kennedy was a big advocate. He went to visit an institution in New York and said and denounced it. Geraldo Rivera had published a famous story talking about Willowbrook, but it didn't change. It was an issue to get excited about, but then nothing really came of it. And it took, at least in Baltimore, the local institution didn't close until 2009. Obviously, a lot of people were still out of it. Even when my brother was born in 1999, doctors suggested looking into institutions. I think, and there's different progress in different places. Then you hear stories about families who raised their child with autism or Down syndrome or cerebral palsy, any number of intellectual disabilities in the home, and sent them to a group home, which were created in the 80s. So there is this timeline, but it's important to remember this went on into the 21st century. And this blatant, like people getting murdered was going on until the 21st century. And so, but I think, and so remembering that history is so important. I think it's obviously because we can't let it happen again. That being said, it also means we can't be afraid of intentional communities and communities which are predominantly people with disabilities. I know, because then you kind of see the other end of the pendulum, and you'll probably talk about this in future weeks with, I know Desiree, she has been a big advocate about this, that a lot of states don't want to have intentional communities because what was an institution? An institution was a group of homes, predominantly people with disabilities. And obviously we need to be so careful about that. And we need to be looking at these homes and we need to be actively involved in them. But we also have to recognize that a community predominantly made up of people with disabilities might be where someone wants to live, might be where they're most comfortable. So history, that.
Yeah, it's so true. Yeah, I mean, here in California, and I think, generally California considers itself to be so progressive. We're closing some of those institutions, just the last ones in the last couple of years. And we closed ours in Santa Clara County here in 2008. And the history of that one is it was for mental illness. So that's what it was. And dating back into the early 1900s, it was a place to isolate the crazies. And I hope we never forget that. And
and that we would learn to remember too alongside.
Yes.
I was like, we never learn about it in history. Our public school curriculum doesn't in anywhere in the US mention disability history.
No.
And disability, obviously not intellectual, like disability is a huge category, but it's also the largest minority in the US is people who are disabilities, and it's the only category to which any of us can enter at any time.
Yep. Okay, so we'll wrap up. Last question. What's next on your journey?
What's next? That's always the question, right? I think it's interesting when I asked that in my book. Yeah, we had no idea. And then in the past couple months, the service provider who provides the direct support for my brother had a house that they operate, which had a room open up, and we met and the other roommates are incredible, and they're some of my closest friends now. And something really worked. So obviously he's still in the early stages, fingers crossed, we're still working on the transition. But for my family, it's kind of starting on this new chapter and this new process, which we couldn't have gotten to without years and years of looking and considering the best options, and also still now looking at how are we making this place a home for my brother, how are we developing the community, how are we building his relationships. And I think what's next for all of us is again not forgetting. And I think you can probably speak to this too in the technology industry. I feel like there's kind of this conflict between innovation, and we want to be in a place that innovates, and we are always talking about innovation right now, and also long term these are homes which are going to last forever. And it doesn't mean the two have to be mutually exclusive, right, but it means we can't. Entrepreneurship is amazing, but we need it to be sustainable. And yep. So I think what's next will depend on who you are and where you are. I mean, please, if you ever have any questions on anything that I wrote about, let me know, and connect with the people everyone I wrote about is happy to connect, and wants to connect and help people.
Well, that reminds me, for those of you out here who haven't read Astri's book, Astri, how can they get it?
Yeah, it's right on Amazon. And also please reach out to me at any time. I'd be happy to talk to you about where you are in the housing journey, or if you're looking to develop a new housing solution, or a place like LSO. Like, these are conversations which need to be had. And I think kind of back, like I was saying, the we need people who want to innovate, who want to build in this sector. And I also, kind of on top of that, sorry, I know we're running out of time, but I want to mention that I think getting siblings involved is also a big process. And I want to say, if there's any parents who ever want to talk about kind of how to address the sibling relationship, I know we've talked about this a lot because it's going to be difficult and different for every sibling. I have a support group at college, which I started with another kid, and everyone has a lot of my sibling relationship, we're very, very close. We always have been. We don't get in too many fights, and they're usually ended well, but other siblings aren't as close, or maybe are going to have different relationships they work through, like you do with any siblings. But I really do think that sibling involvement is going to be a big part of the future, because sibling and other relatives and parents are the ones who are going to help spread the word and help make people aware of the issue in housing and the solutions which are needed.
All right. Well, thanks. Sounds like we should allow for folks to ask some questions. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Astri and Dana, both, for an amazing discussion. We've all learned so much from your insights the past 30 minutes so far. So with that, I would like to move on to the Q&A session. So if any of you in the office or in the audience have any questions, please go to the bottom of your screen and type in your questions on the control panel. So I think a question for Astri, we already have one. Here in the Bay Area, we're working on a model where we have a cluster of homes within supported living within walking distance from each other. This would create a community within a community. Have you seen this in other places on your travels and research? And then this one's for Astri.
Yeah, I mean, that is incredible. First of all, I'm just so excited to hear about that. I'd love to hear more. I have definitely, I think Three Oaks, which I mentioned before, they're also kind of within a larger community. They're, I guess they're making it more like the neighborhood will be all people who have chosen to live in an inclusive housing environment. Not everyone's going to have a disability. It's anyone can buy a house there. It's just people are aware that there will be supportive living. So it's kind of that same thing, like clustering supportive living options near each other with this kind of awareness for everyone. Another group, so L'Arche is a very huge international organization which has group homes. And yes, I think I feel like everyone in this field knows about L'Arche just because they have also a model kind of talking about giving and receiving, and staff can learn as much as they can give is kind of the backbone of their thinking. But in Boston, they have a lot of group homes which are close to each other. Not quite, but they're all kind of within one area, and they do a lot of coordination together. And I think LSA does it. Obviously, you all also have the amazing connections between the group homes, which I think just it's like there's so many facets of LSA which are so amazing, which I wish I could have touched on further in my book, and which you can obviously touch on. But yeah, L'Arche Boston North came to mind because they have certain coordinated programming which they do on a few days within the week to kind of create that wider community. Another group is I was thinking of one in particular, I think Building Ohana, and they're trying to create a live, work, learn community, which is also similar to, I talk about LTO Ventures, and Desiree will be on here later, and her organization is working on a community like that also. But they're also, even though and Camp Hill is another example, and those are also people living with and without disabilities in similar communities, but it's also more focused on kind of the environment, and it's a very all-encompassing culture. So the people living there are all kind of directly involved in the group homes.
Awesome. That's great, Astri. Thank you so much. So a next question we have, someone wants to know, what do you suggest when there are not enough group homes in your area when your child would choose a group home?
And I guess that is the problem right now. And I think, and Dana knows this because it's a crisis in the US, is that there's not enough housing options, and we need them now. We need them very, very urgently. And that was a problem we saw. I think it's difficult to say because there's no easy answer. And it is looking at exhausting all of the options you have, looking further. We visited homes that were 6 hours away. My brother could not be 6 hours away from me. That's terrifying. But just to see what was out there. And I think that's a valuable thing to do, even if it doesn't end up working out. I do think another organization to look at would be Partners for Housing. They're the ones that provide consulting services. They're only in Washington, Arizona, and New York right now. They're looking to expand to other locations, but they have a lot of stuff on creating your own supportive housing option, which is also an option if you want to create supportive living and work with other families to do so. So because if you work with other families, you can pool your resources in a way to make it a financially viable option that's not far off from a traditional provider like LSA. And also, please connect with me. I'd love to talk further about that and find other options.
Great. The next question I have that someone wants to know, in Dana's previous conversation with Brian, they discussed the need for collaboration on a local level. What can be done to increase collaboration to a national scale? And should organizations look beyond local communities to collaborate? So I think that would be a question for Astri, and maybe Dana can also touch on it as well.
Yeah, so I think that's a very big thing, is that expanding and going. I think that's what we're doing right now, right, Dana? Is creating those connections. One person who I think is very who's done an amazing job with looking beyond is Mark Olson, the founder of Point Rider, who their organization consults people on creating intentional communities, and an incredible organization. And it was just reaching out, it was just visiting places, and fortunately he's been able to make that into a full-time job. Most of us can't do that in a full-time job, but I think one organization which you will learn about in the coming weeks is Autism Housing Network, which has houses across the country, and they're trying to increase their database of tons of living options so people can make those connections.
Yeah, I guess my comment on it would be, it sure would be good if we had more national, collaboration going on. But I think a lot of the funding, does come from the federal government through the state governments, the Medicare, Medicaid. But housing, at least traditionally, housing is always local. And, there's talk about, help with housing, on the federal and the state level, but it's relatively rare. So, most organizations find themselves working locally, to find, funding for the house part of the equation. And it also kind of comes back to, the F word that was mentioned earlier by you, Astri, funding. That is actually a big deal. And most of these systems have been underfunded systemically over time. And I think it relates back, to that history. And, the people that we're talking about were marginalized and isolated, for decades. And so they were never a funding priority. And so I think we always have to remember that, that for our advocacy is our number one priority, to be advocating for adequate funding, and including, making the conditions to add capacity favorable. But yeah, that's my comment on it. I'd love to work with others locally, love to work with others, on a broader scope. But sometimes it's hard to, it's hard to focus on, on the issues, because it is a complicated area and system.
And that's something you see decades of parents asking for more funding in that history for the institutions that their children were forced to go into. And it just, oftentimes it would be a conversation and it would never happen.
Right. Well, great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We do have a lot of questions, but I know we're running out of time. So I think we have time for just two more. So this is a question. How can schools promote the inclusion more and promote the awareness as the students move on to college and the workplace?
Obviously, there's kind of two sides to this question. There's a lot of schools which have integrated classrooms, and you have that opportunity to interact with people with disabilities. My school that I went to grade school that did not have those opportunities. Many of my friends, the first person they ever met with a disability was my brother. And this was in high school. So I think making programs available is so incredibly important. And unfortunately, I think, and I guess fortunately, that has to be kind of up to you. I started programs with my brother's school, any connections we could get, anytime we could go over there to help out. and create those friendships. It's about growing those organizations. I think especially for in colleges also, my college does not have any programs for people with intellectual disabilities. There would be no reason to interact. In fact, I feel like I've seen a lot of ignorance. I've heard the R word a lot. I've had to correct a lot of people. But it has to be individuals making those conversations. And I saw another mention talking about siblings and sibling groups. I think, like I said, I think siblings in so many, like, providing safe spaces for siblings is so incredibly important to allowing them to feel comfortable to then talk about their sibling. And my school, we didn't have a support group, and me and my friend met because we were both siblings, and we talked for like 3 hours about that experience, and we're both like sobbing at the end. And we're like, this needs to be a constant conversation, and anyone in this community needs to be a part of this conversation. And so please talk to me if anyone you know wants to start a sibling group at other colleges. I don't know of any others besides ours, and we want to connect with as many siblings as possible. There's sib shops throughout the country, but they close a lot. Like, I looked up one in my community and it closed. And I looked up another, like a lot of them just haven't gotten support because I think it's maybe not prioritized, because sibling, like, I wouldn't think I would need to be in a support group. Like, I was like, my brother's a healthy, happy kid. Why do you think I need support because of that? Like, but it's a really, really valuable experience. And so I think sibling support groups are the way siblings feel comfortable about talking about their siblings, and then can talk to their friends about their siblings. And that's how we increase inclusion.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So we just have one more question for you. It's a comment and a question. Someone says, "You are a wonderful sibling. Thank you for sharing your story. Our son Robbie is 21, and he is so fortunate to have 3 brothers who love him so much. As a mom, I don't want to add anything to their plate, but I know that they will outlive us. How do you recommend talking to and involving siblings when Robbie is only 21? And are there any clubs at colleges, or did you start one for siblings?"
Yes, and I think, Dana, I mean, the parent sibling is a very complex a long conversation. Please reach out to me I know we're running out of time. Yeah, I started a group. Yeah, again, I was talking to another sibling and we were like, oh my gosh, we need this. This is really important. The conversation with siblings, my parents always never wanted to put it on my plate. I was the one who brought it up and was like, and we're gonna start the process of giving me co-guardianship over my brother, because I want to have that. I want to make sure I'm available because he's my person. I need to make sure that he's going to be safe and I'm going to be part of his life in the long term. It's a huge responsibility though. Yeah, and I get why my parents never wanted to put any pressure on me to have that view. And I think just articulating to siblings that you're not putting any pressure on them, that you want them to know that you're going to find supports. That's what my parents, they were like, we're going to try to find a housing solution and find a community for Rob so you can do what you want with your life and you're not beholden to coming back to Baltimore and being with your sibling. And I think that articulation was always very, very valuable, and that communication. That being said, if siblings want to be involved in the guardianship process, I mean, not everyone has guardianship over their kids, so that was kind of the first step for how I can be involved now. I think the conversation isn't a clear one, right, Dana? Wouldn't you say that it's many conversations? Right. It's just about having communication about what's going on. And again, I think meeting other siblings has been very, very helpful for me in figuring out what my relationship to my brother is going to be when we're both adults.
Well, I got to say, yeah, Rob's pretty lucky to have a sister who's, so involved and will be involved and his life going forward.
Oh,
Definitely.
thank you. I'm lucky to have him.
Thank you so much, Astri and Dana, for this amazing Q&A. I know we're running out of time, so quickly before we go, I do have Astri's contact info. So 1 second. So here is if you want to contact LSA. I know we didn't get to all of your questions today, so if you have questions for Dana or if you have questions for Astri, you can contact LSA via email at info@lsahomes.org, or you can follow us on social media and take a look at our website on www.lsahomes.org. And then for Astri's contact info, it should also be in the chat. Connect with her on LinkedIn, have a
Yes,
discussion
connect
with
with
her.
please.
Yeah, and then also don't forget, if you want to purchase Astri's book, also in the chat, it's the link below to go ahead and give her book a read. And finally, we're actually going to give out 5 of Astri's books, signed copies, tonight, and all you have to do is sign up for our newsletter. So that should also be in the chat as well. And if you sign up for our newsletter, you'll be entered in a raffle, and we'll be doing those giveaways, and we'll contact everyone after the webinar. And then finally, next week, join us next week. Ashley Kim Wace, she's the national coordinator for Together for Choice. And she will be discussing obstacles in accessing IDD housing services and leading advocacy. So don't forget to sign up for that next week, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you so much, Astri and Dana again, and thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you guys. Good night.
Good night, everybody, and thanks, Astri, for joining.
Thank you so much, Dana. Have a nice
Thank
night.
you.
Yep. Bye-bye.